The air was thick with incense and expectation as the congregation of Grace Baptist Church in Austin, Texas, gathered for Sunday service. It was an unseasonably warm morning in mid-May, and the golden glow of the sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting a halo-like light on the pulpit where Pastor Elijah Matthews and his wife, Rebecca, stood. Dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, Elijah was every bit the image of a beloved community leader. He had spent the last 12 years preaching the gospel, counseling troubled couples, and baptizing new believers. Beside him, Rebecca, a striking brunette with kind eyes and a soft-spoken nature, stood with her hands clasped, smiling at the flock of devoted church members. Then in an instant, the sanctuary was shattered by a thunderous sound, a gunshot. Screams erupted as the congregation ducked, some falling to their knees, others scrambling toward the exits. The choir gasped in horror as another shot rang out. Elijah stumbled backward, blood blooming across his chest like a crimson flower. Rebecca shrieked as she turned toward him, only for a third bullet to strike her square in the chest. She collapsed beside her husband, their hands nearly touching on the white marble altar. The shooter stood before them, his breathing ragged, his gun still raised. His face, twisted with emotion, was one that many recognized. A well-dressed man, trembling with rage and sorrow. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sounds were the sobs of churchgoers and the steady, deliberate footsteps of the killer as he turned and walked down the aisle, past the horrified congregation, toward the wide-open doors. By the time the first responders arrived, Elijah and Rebecca Matthews were dead, and the man who had ended their lives had vanished into the Texas heat. Detective Tom Grayson had seen his fair share of homicides in his 25 years with the Austin Police Department, but this one felt different from the moment his phone rang. It was still early, just past 9:30 a.m., and he had been enjoying his usual Sunday ritual, a quiet morning on his back porch with a cup of black coffee and the sports section of the Austin American-Statesman. "Grayson," he answered, already bracing himself for bad news. "Double homicide at Grace Baptist Church," came the voice of his partner, Detective Linda Vasquez. "The pastor and his wife, shot in front of a packed congregation." Grayson exhaled sharply. "Suspect? Fled the scene. We got multiple witnesses. People are shaken up, but one name keeps coming up." "Who?" "Michael Reed," Vasquez said, "the church's youth minister, and apparently the pastor's longtime friend." Grayson grabbed his keys and was out the door within minutes. By the time Grayson arrived at Grace Baptist Church, it was a madhouse. Police cars lined the parking lot, their red and blue lights flashing against the morning sky. News vans were already stationed outside, eager to capture the scandal that was sure to rock the small community. Inside, the scene was haunting. The smell of blood mixed with the lingering scent of perfume and aftershave. The once pristine altar was now stained with red, the bodies of Elijah and Rebecca Matthews still lying where they had fallen. Grayson crouched beside Elijah's body. "Close-range shots," he murmured, studying the bullet wounds. Whoever did this wanted it to be personal. Linda Vasquez nodded, flipping through her notepad. "Witnesses say the shooter walked right up to them. No hesitation." "Who's this Michael Reed?" Grayson asked, rising to his feet. Vasquez's expression hardened. "The church's youth minister. He's been close to the pastor for years. Too close, according to some members. People say he and Elijah were like brothers. Brothers don't usually shoot each other in the heart." Vasquez sighed. "And they don't usually have secret affairs either." Grayson's head snapped toward her. "Come again." She lowered her voice. "Word is, Michael and Elijah were more than just friends. We need to dig into this." Grayson looked back at the bodies. A pastor, his wife, murdered in cold blood in front of an entire congregation. And now whispers of a scandal that no one had seen coming. Something told him this case was going to be unlike any other. Detective Tom Grayson had always believed that the worst crimes were the ones rooted in love and betrayal. Now, as he stood in the middle of Grace Baptist Church, staring down at the lifeless bodies of Pastor Elijah Matthews and his wife Rebecca, he knew this was one of those cases. His partner, Detective Linda Vasquez, had already begun questioning witnesses, members of the congregation who had been too horrified to move after witnessing the murder. The suspect, Michael Reed, was nowhere to be found, but his name was on everyone's lips. Grayson walked outside where officers had set up a perimeter. The Texas sun was relentless, making the blood drying on his shirt collar feel even heavier. He lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply before exhaling toward the sky. "Anything?" he asked Vasquez as she approached. "Got a few solid statements?" she replied. "Most people are saying the same thing." Michael Reed walked up to the altar, pulled out a gun, and shot them both without hesitation. Then he just walked out. Did he say anything? A few witnesses say he whispered something before pulling the trigger, but they couldn't make it out. Grayson rubbed his temples. So we have a packed church, a respected pastor, and his wife executed in broad daylight by a man who, up until today, was their close friend. "More than close," Vasquez muttered. Yeah, Grayson said. "I caught that." "You really think Michael and Elijah were having an affair?" "Some members of the church suspected it for a while. A few even say Rebecca knew." Grayson took another drag of his cigarette. "Then we need to find out exactly what she knew." And when the medical examiner arrived and the bodies were transported to the morgue, Grayson and Vasquez followed in their unmarked car, silence stretching between them as they drove through the streets of Austin. "Elijah Matthews," Vasquez said, flipping through her notes. 45 years old, married for 18 years, no kids. He built this church from the ground up, known for his passionate sermons about marriage, fidelity, and family values. And now he's dead because of a secret affair," Grayson muttered. "Rebecca Matthews," Vasquez continued, 42, former teacher, resigned from her job last year to work full-time at the church. By all accounts, she was a devoted wife. "Unless she knew about the affair," Grayson said, "then that devotion might have been something else." They pulled into the medical examiner's office, where Dr. Ethan Caldwell, an old friend of Grayson's, was already waiting. "Double homicide in a church," Caldwell said, shaking his head. "I thought I'd seen it all. Any early observations?" Grayson asked. Caldwell pulled back the sheet covering Elijah Matthews. "Single gunshot wound to the chest. Clean entry, no exit. Likely a .38 caliber round." He moved to Rebecca's body. Same caliber, shot in the heart, almost like a crime of passion, Grayson finished. Caldwell nodded. Exactly. Grayson's gut told him this wasn't just a random act of violence. Michael Reed had executed them. But why now? What had finally pushed him over the edge? Michael Reed had vanished. His apartment was empty, his car was gone, and his phone was turned off. Vasquez managed to get in touch with his sister, who lived in Dallas. "He hasn't called me," she said over the phone. "But I know Michael. He wouldn't do something like this." "Ma'am," Vasquez said, "do you know if Michael was romantically involved with Pastor Matthews?" There was silence on the other end, then a slow exhale. I had my suspicions," his sister admitted. "Michael never had a serious girlfriend, and he and Elijah were," she paused. "They were too close, closer than just friends. But I never thought it would come to this." Vasquez hung up and turned to Grayson. "We need to find him before someone else does." Grayson agreed, because if Michael Reed was desperate enough to kill in front of a packed church, he was desperate enough to do anything. Back at the station, an officer handed Grayson an evidence bag. "This was found in Rebecca Matthews' purse at the crime scene," he said. Inside was an envelope, its contents a single handwritten note. "Elijah, I know what you've been doing. I kept your secret for too long. I won't anymore. Meet me at the church tomorrow morning. Alone." There was no signature, but Grayson didn't need one. Rebecca knew, and she had been ready to confront him. Detective Tom Grayson sat at his desk, staring at the note found in Rebecca Matthews' purse. The words were clear, sharp like a blade slicing through the image of a perfect marriage. "Elijah, I know what you've been doing. I kept your secret for too long. I won't anymore. Meet me at the church tomorrow morning, alone." There was no signature, but one thing was obvious. Rebecca had known about her husband's secret, and judging by the way she and Elijah were murdered, Michael Reed knew she knew. Linda Vasquez leaned against the desk, arms crossed. If Rebecca was planning to confront him, that means she wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a target. Or collateral damage, Grayson said. Either way, this was planned. The question was, how long had this been building? By afternoon, Grayson and Vasquez were combing through Elijah Matthews' background, looking for cracks in the story of the perfect pastor. He wasn't always a preacher, Vasquez said, clicking through files on her laptop. Before he started Grace Baptist, he worked as a financial analyst in Dallas. Grayson raised an eyebrow. That's a hell of a career switch. Wait, it gets better. Vasquez turned the screen toward him. 15 years ago, Elijah was caught in a fraud investigation. Company funds went missing. He wasn't convicted, but he left the finance world right after. So he wasn't a saint before he became a pastor, Grayson muttered. Figures. Then there's Michael Reed, Vasquez continued. He joined the church 8 years ago. Single, no kids, no known relationships. He was basically Elijah's right-hand man. Grayson exhaled. So how does a financial analyst turned pastor and a young church worker end up in a secret affair? Vasquez smirked. I called around. Some people say Michael and Elijah took mission trips together. Just the two of them, yeah? One trip was to Miami, the other to Vegas. Grayson let out a low whistle. Vegas? Now that doesn't scream missionary work. Exactly. I think Rebecca found out Elijah and Michael were more than brothers in Christ, and she wasn't about to keep the secret anymore. That was motive enough for murder. Grayson and Vasquez headed back to Grace Baptist Church, where a few members of the congregation had gathered, still in shock from the morning's events. An older woman, Ruth Langley, was one of the longest-serving church volunteers. She wiped her red-rimmed eyes with a tissue as she spoke. Pastor Matthews was a good man, she whispered. He did so much for this community. Mrs. Langley, Grayson said gently, did you ever notice anything unusual between him and Michael Reed? She hesitated. Ma'am, Vasquez pressed, we're not here to judge. We're here to find the truth. Ruth exhaled shakily. I don't know for sure, but I noticed the way Michael looked at him, like he was in love. And sometimes Elijah looked back the same way. Did Rebecca notice? Ruth nodded slowly. She wasn't stupid. I think she ignored it for a long time. But a few weeks ago, I saw her crying after service. When I asked what was wrong, she just shook her head and said, I can't pretend anymore. Grayson and Vasquez exchanged a look. That note in her purse. This was what she couldn't pretend about anymore. And that confrontation had cost her life. The hunt for Michael Reed had hit a dead end. His phone was still off. His bank accounts hadn't been touched. His car hadn't been spotted anywhere in Austin. Grayson sat in the squad car thinking. Michael had no plan to run. He shot them in front of a packed church, then walked out. He wanted to be seen. Then why disappear? Vasquez asked. Because he's not done. Vasquez frowned. You think he's going after someone else? Grayson nodded. If this was a crime of passion, he might not be finished settling scores. Vasquez started making calls while Grayson stared out the window. Michael Reed wasn't a trained killer. He wasn't a hitman. He was a man who had let something simmer inside him for years, and now it had exploded. Just before midnight, Grayson's phone buzzed. It was a local news alert. Breaking, fugitive. Michael Reed spotted at a motel off I-35. Grayson's pulse quickened. We've got him. Vasquez grabbed her jacket. Let's move. This was it. The end of the chase. But what they found inside that motel room would change everything. Detective Tom Grayson gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped down I-35. Vasquez in the passenger seat. The night air was thick with anticipation. Michael Reed had finally surfaced. News says he checked into the Lone Star Motel about an hour ago, Vasquez said, loading her service pistol. Room 206. Grayson nodded. We go in quiet, no heroics. If he's armed, we do this by the book. Minutes later, they pulled into the motel parking lot. A couple of squad cars were already there. Lights off, officers waiting for their command. Grayson stepped out and scanned the second floor. Room 206. A dim light flickered through the curtains. He's in there, Vasquez whispered. They moved fast, boots silent on the concrete walkway. Grayson pressed his ear to the door, muffled sobbing. He motioned to Vasquez. Gun drawn, she nodded. Michael Reed, Austin PD. Grayson called out. Open the door, silence, then. A gunshot. Grayson didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open. The room reeked of sweat, alcohol, and gunpowder. The TV blared static, and Michael Reed sat on the edge of the bed, pistol in his shaking hands. His face was streaked with tears. "Drop the weapon, Michael," Vasquez ordered, gun trained on him. Michael let out a ragged laugh. "I already pulled the trigger once. What's one more time?" Grayson took a careful step forward. "You don't want to do this, Michael." Michael shook his head violently. "I already lost everything. Elijah's gone. Rebecca's gone. I have nothing left." "Then tell us the truth," Grayson said, voice steady. "Why did you kill them?" Michael looked up, his eyes empty. "Because he lied to me," he whispered. Michael's voice was hoarse, filled with pain. "Elijah loved me, or at least, that's what he told me." He let out a hollow chuckle. 8 years. 8 damn years I gave to that man. I did everything for him. I kept his secret, played along while he stood on that altar, preaching about marriage and fidelity. Vasquez shifted. "Did Rebecca know?" Michael nodded. "I think she always suspected, but she never confronted me. Not until last night." Grayson's pulse quickened. "What happened last night?" Michael wiped his eyes. "She called me, said she knew the truth, said she was done being the obedient pastor's wife, that she was going to expose everything, to the church, to the media." His fingers clenched around the gun. "She said Elijah promised he would end things with me, but he didn't. He never planned to." "So you killed them," Vasquez said coldly. Michael shook his head. "I went there to stop her. I begged her not to do it." His breath hitched. "And Elijah, he just stood there. Didn't fight for me. Didn't defend me. He looked at me like I was nothing." Grayson exhaled. "And that broke you?" Michael gave a sad smile. "I gave him everything, detective, and he threw me away like trash." Vasquez took a step closer. "Put the gun down, Michael." "It's over." Tears ran down Michael's face as he stared at them. Then in a broken whisper, he said, "It was over the moment I pulled the trigger." He placed the gun under his chin. "Michael, no!" Grayson shouted. A gunshot rang out. Blood splattered against the wall. Michael Reed collapsed. And just like that, the last living piece of the story was gone. Grayson and Vasquez sat outside the motel, exhausted. "The bastard killed himself," Vasquez muttered, rubbing her temples. "We'll never know the whole story now." Grayson looked up at the sky. "We know enough. The truth was simple. Elijah Matthews had built a life on secrets, a double life. And when those secrets came crashing down, so did he. The church would mourn. The city would move on. But the sanctuary that once preached love and loyalty would always bear the stain of betrayal and blood." 2 days after the tragedy at Grace Baptist Church, the city of Austin was still in shock. The congregation gathered outside the church, candles flickering in the evening wind. Reporters swarmed the scene, eager for the latest twist in the story of the fallen pastor. Detective Tom Grayson stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed. His job was done. At least that's what his boss believed. The case was closed. Michael Reed, scorned lover, shot Elijah and Rebecca Matthews in a fit of rage, then killed himself. Open and shut. But something about it didn't sit right. "Still thinking about it?" Vasquez asked, walking up beside him. Grayson exhaled. "Something's off." Vasquez arched a brow. "Off how?" "We have motive, confession, and a dead suspect. What more do you need?" Grayson looked at the church. "Michael said he shot them because Elijah betrayed him, because Rebecca was going to expose him." "Yeah, but if he planned to kill them, why do it in front of the entire congregation?" Vasquez frowned. "You think someone else was involved?" Grayson nodded. "Something tells me we haven't heard the whole story yet." The next morning, Grayson received the final autopsy reports. As he flipped through them, his stomach tightened. Elijah Matthews, gunshot wound to the chest. Instant death. Rebecca Matthews, gunshot wound to the abdomen. Bled out within minutes. Michael Reed, self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. That all made sense. But then, Michael Reed's toxicology report, high traces of lorazepam. Grayson's pulse quickened. Lorazepam, a powerful sedative. Michael was drugged before he pulled the trigger. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. Vasquez peered over his shoulder. "Someone dosed him?" Looks that way. Grayson grabbed his coat. We need to go back to the church. At Grace Baptist, the doors were locked. But Grayson had spoken to Ruth Langley, the elderly church volunteer, and she had agreed to meet them. She led them inside, her frail hands shaking. This place used to be sacred, she whispered. Now it's just a crime scene. Grayson didn't reply. His eyes scanned the pulpit, the rows of empty pews, the lingering sense of something hidden beneath the surface. Mrs. Langley, Vasquez asked, did you ever notice anything suspicious about Michael in the days leading up to the shooting? Ruth hesitated. Mrs. Langley, Grayson pressed, Michael was drugged before he killed Elijah and Rebecca. That means someone set him up. The old woman's breath hitched. Oh, dear Lord, Grayson exchanged a glance with Vasquez. You know something, don't you? Ruth nodded slowly. It wasn't just Elijah hiding things. Who else? Ruth lowered her voice. The church elders. Ruth led them to the pastor's office, where Elijah once sat in power. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside were financial records, private letters, and emails between Elijah and the church elders. Grayson flipped through them. What the hell is this? Bribes, Ruth whispered. Payoffs. Elijah was paying people to keep his secret. The elders knew about Michael, knew about the affair, but as long as he kept the money flowing, they stayed quiet. Vasquez exhaled. So when Rebecca threatened to expose him, the elders panicked, Grayson finished, and they needed Michael to take the fall. The pieces fell into place. Michael hadn't planned a murder. He had been manipulated, drugged, pushed to the edge. The elders had set him up to take the blame while they kept their hands clean. And now, with Michael dead, the real masterminds were still walking free. Grayson clenched his jaw. This case wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Detective Tom Grayson sat at his desk, eyes locked on the pile of documents Ruth Langley had given him. Bribes, secrets, cover-ups. Grace Baptist Church wasn't just a place of worship. It was a house of corruption. Vasquez paced beside him. So let me get this straight. The church elders knew about Elijah's affair, kept it quiet, and when Rebecca threatened to expose it, they panicked? Grayson nodded. And they needed a scapegoat. Michael was perfect, already emotionally unstable, obsessed with Elijah. All they had to do was push him over the edge. But why kill Rebecca and Elijah in front of the whole church? That seems reckless for a cover-up. Grayson tapped the autopsy report. They drugged Michael. He wasn't in control. Someone made sure he was high on lorazepam before he pulled that trigger. Vasquez frowned. And that someone is still out there. Grayson picked up the list of church elders. Time to shake the tree and see what falls out. Grace Baptist's elders met every Wednesday evening in a private room behind the pulpit. When Grayson and Vasquez arrived, the meeting was in full swing. 8 men sat in a circle, dressed in crisp suits. The moment the detectives walked in, conversation stopped. Detectives, said Carl Whitmore, the head elder, his voice calm but wary. To what do we owe the pleasure? Grayson tossed the autopsy report onto the table. Michael Reed was drugged before he pulled the trigger, and we have reason to believe one of you had something to do with it. A murmur ran through the group. Whitmore remained unfazed. That's a serious accusation, Detective. Vasquez folded her arms. So is murder. The air grew thick. Then from the far end of the table, David Holt, another elder, cleared his throat. This is absurd. Michael was a jealous, unstable man. He was your puppet, Grayson cut in. You knew Rebecca was about to blow this whole thing open, so you took care of it the easiest way possible. You gave Michael just enough of a push to do your dirty work for you. Holt's face twitched. That's nonsense. Is it? Grayson leaned in. Because according to bank records, a few of you received substantial donations from Pastor Elijah in the months leading up to his death. He dropped the papers onto the table. Payoffs, to keep quiet about his affair. Silence. Grayson let it sink in. And when Rebecca threatened to expose him, you all had a choice. Let the scandal ruin you or control the narrative. Michael was your insurance policy. Carl Whitmore steepled his fingers. Detective, you have no proof of that. Grayson smiled. Not yet, but I will. Back at the station, Vasquez leaned on Grayson's desk. Who do you think is our best shot? Grayson flipped through the elder list. Whitmore is too smart. Holt is too arrogant. But this guy, he tapped the name Daniel Moore. Vasquez raised a brow. The accountant? He handled all the church's finances. If there's a paper trail, he knows about it. Think he'll talk? Grayson smirked. Everyone talks when they're scared enough. Daniel Moore's house was modest compared to the lavish homes of the other elders. He answered the door in a wrinkled shirt, sweat on his brow. You shouldn't be here, he stammered. Then let's talk somewhere private, Grayson said. Inside, Moore fidgeted. I didn't have a choice. Vasquez narrowed her eyes. So you admit you were involved? Moore swallowed hard. I was just following orders. Grayson leaned forward. Who drugged Michael? Moore hesitated. Then in a near whisper, he said Carl Whitmore. Vasquez exhaled sharply. That son of a... He said it was the only way, Moore continued. Michael was already unstable. We just needed him to snap at the right time. Whitmore slipped the sedative into his drink before the service. By the time he got to the altar, he wasn't thinking straight. Grayson's jaw tightened. And you just let it happen? Moore shook his head. I wanted out. But Whitmore, he doesn't take betrayal lightly. He rubbed his hands together, voice shaking. I think he's planning something worse. Grayson exchanged a look with Vasquez. If Whitmore had already orchestrated 2 murders, he wouldn't hesitate to do it again. And now the biggest wolf in the flock knew they were coming for him. Detective Tom Grayson knew time was running out. Carl Whitmore wasn't just a manipulative church elder. He was a murderer. And now that Daniel Moore had confessed, Whitmore had every reason to silence him. Grayson and Vasquez rushed back to Moore's house, sirens wailing through the quiet Texas night. But as they pulled up, a terrible sight awaited them. Moore's front door was wide open. Vasquez drew her gun. Damn it. They moved in, cautiously stepping inside. The house was eerily silent. Then, a gunshot. Upstairs, Grayson shouted, bolting up the steps. They found Daniel Moore slumped against the bedroom wall, a bullet in his chest. His lips moved, barely a whisper. Whitmore knew I talked. His eyes fluttered shut. He was gone. Grayson clenched his jaw. Whitmore's tying up loose ends. Vasquez exhaled sharply. We need to move. Now Carl Whitmore was a man of power and control, but power meant nothing if he was exposed. Grayson had no doubt. Whitmore would run. Back at the precinct, they ran a trace on his phone. It pinged at a private airstrip outside Austin. He's leaving the country, Vasquez muttered. Not if we get there first, Grayson said, grabbing his keys. The airstrip was dimly lit, the hum of a private jet engine roaring in the distance. Whitmore stood near the plane, his expensive suit still immaculate, even now. Beside him, a hired bodyguard clutched a pistol. Grayson and Vasquez stepped forward, guns drawn. Game's over, Whitmore, Grayson called out. Put your hands up. Whitmore smirked. Detective, I have no idea what you're talking about. Vasquez scoffed. Oh, cut the act. We know you drugged Michael. We know you staged the entire thing. Whitmore shook his head. Michael was weak. He let his emotions control him. I simply guided him. Grayson took a step closer. And Daniel Moore? Did you guide him too? Whitmore's face darkened. He was a liability. Grayson gritted his teeth. You used Michael, drugged him, and let him take the fall. But Michael didn't plan this. You did. You made sure the scandal wouldn't ruin you. Rebecca Matthews was going to expose everything. The affairs, the bribes, the corruption. You couldn't let that happen. Whitmore's smile faded. You played God, Grayson continued, but even God answers to the law. Whitmore sighed. Then in a blur of motion, he grabbed his bodyguard's gun. Bang! Vasquez fired first. Whitmore's body jerked as the bullet struck his chest. He collapsed onto the tarmac, gasping. The jet engines roared behind him, but Whitmore wouldn't be boarding that flight. Grayson crouched beside him. You thought you could control everything, but in the end, you were just another sinner facing judgment. Whitmore's lips curled into a bitter smile before his breath hitched. His body went still. It was over. The headlines the next morning were explosive. Corruption in the church. Grace Baptist elder masterminded pastor's murder. Secret affair leads to deadly betrayal. Detectives crack open and shut case to reveal. Dark truth. The congregation of Grace Baptist was shattered, but at least they now knew the truth. Michael Reed had pulled the trigger, but he wasn't the villain. He was a victim of love, of manipulation, of a man who thought he could rewrite fate. As Grayson sat in his office, he sighed heavily. This case had been different. Not just another crime, but a story of power, secrets, and the cost of deception. Vasquez sat across from him. Another one for the books, huh? Grayson nodded. Yeah, but this one cuts deep, she smiled faintly. At least we got justice. Grayson looked out the window at the Texas sky. Justice, maybe, but in the end, there were no saints in this story, only sinners.